It began as an ordinary dawn in the high country, the kind where mist curls between the trees and the mountains feel ancient and eternal. Ethan Ward, a quiet man with a past he no longer spoke of, was cataloging tracks near his research outpost when his German shepherd, Shadow, froze. The dog's ears twitched, his body stiffened. Then, a sound. Faint, almost lost in the wind. A cry. Not the call of an animal, but something smaller. Human. Shadow took off before Ethan could stop him, vanishing into the fog. When Ethan followed, crashing through the brush, he found a sight that stopped his heart. A little girl, barely 8 years old, lying motionless beneath a fallen pine. Her face was pale, her clothes torn, her tiny hand curled into Shadow's fur, as if she already knew he was her protector. That single moment, the dog who found her, the man who carried her, set in motion a story of survival, redemption, and the power of a bond that could heal 3 broken souls. The first light of dawn crept over the jagged peaks of the western mountains, painting the horizon in streaks of amber and rose. The forest below still held its breath, that heavy, reverent silence that only comes before the world wakes. Thin wisps of mist drifted between the trees, and the tall pines stood like ancient sentinels, their dark trunks glistening with dew. Inside a small research cabin tucked between 2 ridges, Ethan Ward stirred awake to the distant call of a hawk. He blinked against the cold light filtering through the frosted window and reached instinctively for his coffee pot, the first ritual of every morning. The cabin was neat to the point of obsession. Notebooks stacked by date, field cameras aligned by model, maps pinned in layers on the back wall. It was a life built on structure, one that kept chaos at bay. For 10 years, Ethan had lived this way, alone in the wild, observing nature's patterns, charting the migration routes of predators that most people never saw up close. Solitude had become his companion, but beneath the calm of his days, something hollow had lingered, a shadow of loss that no data or discovery could ever fill. He poured black coffee into a chipped mug, the same one he'd used since his first field expedition. The smell reminded him of mornings long gone, the kind when laughter filled the house before a dog's tail thumped happily against the floorboards. His rescue dog, Ranger, had died years ago in a field accident. Ethan still remembered the echo of that final whimper. Since then, silence had become his only certainty. Yet this morning, something in that silence felt wrong. He stepped outside, coffee in hand, boots crunching over frost. The forest air was cold enough to sting his lungs. He took in the familiar rhythm of the wilderness, the drip of melting snow, the distant rush of a stream thawing beneath the ice. Everything was as it should be, until he heard it. A sound. Faint. Broken. Almost lost beneath the wind. At first, he thought it was just a branch creaking. But then it came again. A soft, wavering cry that didn't belong to any bird or animal he recognized. There was a rawness to it, something between pain and fear. Ethan froze, listening. The sound drifted again through the trees, weaker now, like something calling for help through layers of mist. His pulse quickened. He set the mug on the porch railing and grabbed his field pack. Probably a wounded elk, he muttered, trying to ground himself in logic. But he knew better. His years in the field had trained him to distinguish cries, the low distress of deer, the short yelps of foxes, the deep growl of bears. This sound was different. It carried desperation that pierced the rational part of his mind and went straight to instinct. As he moved into the forest, his breath turned to fog before him. The world narrowed to sound, the crunch of his boots, the faint rustle of branches, and that cry. distant, but pulling him deeper. He passed old tree scars where lightning had once split trunks, followed game trails winding down the slope, and ducked beneath drooping boughs. The forest seemed to hold its breath with him. Every step brought him closer until the sound became clearer, a trembling, gasping whine. And then, silence. He stopped, heart hammering. A faint metallic glint caught his eye in the underbrush ahead. That was when the smell hit him. Sharp, coppery, unmistakable. Time 500. Blood. He pushed through the ferns, branches clawing at his jacket, and emerged into a small clearing. There, beneath a cluster of spruce, he saw it. A young German shepherd, tangled in a wire snare. The animal lay half-collapsed, its fur matted with mud and blood. The wire had cut deep into its neck and foreleg, biting through skin and muscle. Its breathing came in short, shallow rasps, eyes wide with exhaustion and pain. The ground around it was torn from desperate struggle, drag marks, paw prints, and a faint trail of blood leading nowhere. Ethan froze, his breath catching. In all his years of research, he'd seen traps, cruel instruments left by poachers. But seeing a dog caught like this struck him differently. Something broke open inside him. That place he'd sealed years ago when Ranger died. He knelt slowly, keeping his voice low. Easy, easy now. The dog's eyes flicked toward him, pupils wide, body trembling. It tried to growl but could only manage a choked whine. Ethan reached for his field kit and pulled out his tranquilizer syringe. His hands shook. One wrong move could send the animal into shock. "Not gonna hurt you, buddy. I've got you." He loaded the dart, aimed carefully, and whispered, "You're safe now." The tranquilizer hissed softly as it struck the dog's flank. The animal stiffened, then sagged into stillness, its breathing shallow but steady. Ethan exhaled a shaky breath and dropped to his knees beside it. He examined the wound. Deep, cruel, but not yet fatal. "You've been fighting for days," he murmured softly. "God, how long were you out here alone?" As the sedative took hold, Ethan began to work. With surgical precision, he cut the wire, inch by inch, freeing the dog from its cage of pain. When the last coil snapped free, he lifted the limp body carefully into his arms. The dog was heavier than it looked, solid muscle beneath the filth. Rain began to fall, slow at first, then steady, soaking through his jacket as he climbed back toward the outpost. The forest faded into gray behind him, the sound of rain masking the soft rasp of the dog's breathing. By the time Ethan reached his cabin, the sky had opened completely. He laid the animal on a tarp near the wood stove and worked through the night, cleaning, stitching, bandaging, every movement guided by memory and determination. The lantern light flickered over his tired face, highlighting the streaks of mud and blood on his hands. When at last he finished, he sat beside the dog, whispering, "You're gonna make it. I promise." The animal stirred, eyes fluttering open for a brief second, and then, almost imperceptibly, a paw lifted, pressing weakly against Ethan's wrist. That single gesture, wordless, fragile, shattered something inside him. He bowed his head, tears mixing with rainwater and blood. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the small cabin, something sacred had begun. The first spark of connection between two souls who had both forgotten what it meant to be saved. The forest had fallen silent again, as if holding its breath for what Ethan was about to do. The young German shepherd lay tangled in the poacher's snare, body trembling from exhaustion, sides heaving shallowly. The cruel wire glinted like a snake coiled around its prey, slicing deep into living flesh. Each breath the dog took made the wire tighten. Ethan's pulse hammered. He knelt in the mud, water seeping through his jeans, rain dripping from his hood. For a moment, he couldn't move. His scientific mind screamed caution, but his heart was already disobeying. He had seen traps before, foxes, coyotes, even deer, but never a shepherd. A domesticated dog in the wild, alone, dying like this? It made no sense. The sight tore through the thin layer of professionalism he had spent years building. The researcher in him vanished, leaving only a man who could no longer watch something suffer. "Easy, boy," he murmured softly. His voice shook. "I'm here now." The dog's eyes flicked toward him. Not wild, not feral, just scared and pleading. They were deep brown, filled with something almost human, a fragile trust in a world that had only given it pain. Ethan reached for his tranquilizer gun. His hands trembled as he loaded the dart. The rain had begun to fall harder, drumming on the leaves above, mixing with the faint, steady drip of blood into the mud. "You're gonna feel a little sting," he whispered. "Then you'll sleep. I'll take care of you." The dart hissed through the air, embedding softly in the dog's flank. For a heartbeat, the animal stiffened, eyes wide. Time 400 mems. Then its body began to relax, trembling, easing into stillness. Its head sagged against the soaked ground. Ethan exhaled sharply, pressing a hand against his chest to steady his own heartbeat. He waited, counting the seconds until the dog's breathing slowed, ensuring the sedative had taken hold. Only then did he move closer. The smell of iron and rot filled his nose. Flies rose in clouds when he touched the wound. The wire had buried itself nearly half an inch into the neck, skin swollen and infected. He could see muscle fibers pulsing faintly beneath the torn fur. His jaw tightened. God, what kind of monster does this? He pulled a knife from his belt and began to cut through the snare. The steel was wet and slippery in his hands. The wire fought him, twisted, barbed, designed to hold. It took nearly a full minute before the first strand snapped free. The recoil stung his wrist, but he didn't stop. "Hold on, boy," he muttered. "Just a little longer." The rain poured harder now, turning the ground to red-streaked mud. Ethan's hair clung to his forehead, his breath coming in short bursts as he fought the wire. He could feel the tremor in his muscles, part fatigue, part fear. Finally, the last coil came loose with a metallic twang. The snare fell open like a broken serpent. Ethan tossed it aside and pressed gauze against the wound, watching the blood seep through instantly. He moved quickly, wrapping bandages from his field kit around the neck and leg, then checked the pulse. Weak, but steady. Relief rushed through him so fast he nearly laughed. The rain began to blur his vision. Or maybe it wasn't just rain. He wiped his eyes roughly with the back of his hand. "Let's get you home," he whispered. He slid his arms under the limp body and lifted. The dog was heavier than he expected, solid muscle beneath the malnourishment, soaked fur clinging to his chest. Ethan gritted his teeth and began the long climb back toward camp. The forest around him blurred into streaks of gray and green. Every step was agony. The terrain slick, the slope steep, his boots sinking into mud. But he kept moving, each breath sinking with the faint rhythm of the dog's chest against his arm. At one point, his foot slipped on a wet rock, and he nearly went down. He twisted his body mid-fall to shield the dog, hitting the ground shoulder first with a muffled grunt. Pain shot through him, but the dog didn't move. He looked down, still breathing. That was all that mattered. By the time he reached the cabin, night had fallen fully. The rain had turned into a cold, relentless curtain, hammering the roof like 1,000 small fists. Ethan kicked the door open with his boot and staggered inside. He laid the dog gently on a tarp near the wood stove, where warmth still lingered from the morning fire. The glow of the lantern threw trembling shadows across the walls. His hands were shaking as he pulled off his wet jacket, reaching for antiseptic and sutures. For hours, there was only the rhythm of work. Scissors cutting bandages, water boiling, Ethan's voice whispering reassurance into the dim light. "You're not dying out here. Not after this. Not today." The wound on the neck was the worst. The wire had cut a deep crescent just shy of the jugular. Another half-inch, and the dog would have bled out before sunrise. Ethan cleaned it carefully, stopping every few minutes to steady his breath. The metallic scent of blood filled the small cabin, mingling with the faint aroma of disinfectant and wet pine. As he stitched the final wound, exhaustion hit him like a wave. His arms ached, eyes gritty from focus. He wrapped the dog in an old wool blanket and sat beside him, back against the wall, watching the shallow rise and fall of the animal's chest. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley. The sound reminded him of another storm years ago, the one that took Ranger from him. Back then, he hadn't been fast enough. He had buried that guilt beneath research, data, solitude. But now, in this flickering light, he saw a chance at redemption. He reached out slowly, resting his hand on the dog's head. "You're gonna make it," he whispered, voice breaking. "I promise." For a long moment, there was only the sound of rain and the steady ticking of the lantern flame. Then, something small, almost imperceptible, happened. The dog stirred. Its paw twitched beneath the blanket, then lifted weakly. With the last of its strength, it rested that paw on Ethan's wrist. He froze. His breath caught in his throat. The touch was feather light, but it was enough. Enough to break every wall he'd built. Ethan bowed his head, eyes burning, his hand trembling beneath the small weight of trust. "Yeah," he whispered, voice barely audible. "I'm here." Outside, lightning flashed through the rain, illuminating the cabin for an instant. A man and a wounded dog, two lost souls caught in the same fragile circle of light. In that moment, the wilderness didn't feel empty anymore. It felt alive and listening. The first week passed like a fragile dream. Ethan barely left the cabin except to fetch water or firewood. Every time he looked at the German shepherd lying by the stove, he wondered if he'd wake to find that faint rise and fall of the blanket had stopped. But the dog clung to life with quiet defiance, breath after breath, heartbeat after heartbeat. Each day, the wilderness pressed its face against the cabin windows. Snow, wind, silence. But inside, something warmer had begun to take root. Ethan set up a makeshift infirmary in the corner. Clean rags folded with precision, medical notes scrawled across the margins of old research journals. He tracked the dog's temperature, pulse, hydration, habits from years of field medicine. Yet this time, it wasn't just science. It was personal. When the dog's eyes opened fully for the first time, Ethan felt his throat tighten. They were deep brown, alert now, lucid, filled with a strange intelligence. For a moment, man and dog simply stared at each other, the silence between them saying everything words could not. "Hey," Ethan said softly. "You made it." The dog blinked once, then shifted slightly, wincing from the bandages. Ethan reached out slowly and placed a bowl of water beside him. The shepherd sniffed, hesitated, and began to drink. That sound, small, rhythmic lapping, was the sweetest music Ethan had heard in years. He smiled. "Guess we're not done yet." The days that followed became a rhythm. Not unlike the field routines Ethan once lived by, but softer, more human. Morning. He'd check the wounds, replace the bandages, and talk as he worked, just to fill the silence. "You've got fight in you," he'd say, or, "Don't, give me that look. Antibiotics taste worse than they smell." Afternoon. He'd boil meat scraps or canned stew, cutting it into pieces, cooling it carefully before placing the bowl beside the dog. The first time the shepherd accepted food from his hand, Ethan nearly laughed, a short, disbelieving sound that startled even himself. Evening. He'd read by lantern light, the dog resting nearby, eyes half closed, ears twitching at every sound of the night. By the end of the second week, the dog could lift himself onto his front legs. The first time he tried to stand, Ethan rushed forward to steady him. "Easy there," he said, crouching low. "You're not chasing elk yet." The shepherd gave a low, disgruntled whine, not of pain, but pride. Ethan chuckled under his breath. "Yeah, I get it. You don't like being weak. Neither do I." It became their unspoken language. Glances, gestures, tones of voice. The cabin, once filled only with creaking wood and the hum of wind, now held something new: companionship. By the third week, the shepherd had begun to follow Ethan around the cabin. At first, it was cautious. A soft shuffle of paws, staying a few feet behind as Ethan cooked or sorted field data. Then closer, always silent, always watching. "Shadow," Ethan muttered one morning without thinking. "You move like one." The dog tilted his head. Ethan smiled. "Yeah, that's it. Shadow suits you." From that moment, the name stuck. Not chosen, but discovered, like it had been waiting all along. Winter deepened. The forest outside was blanketed in snow, each tree heavy with white silence. For Ethan, the outpost had always been a fortress against loneliness. But now, it felt alive. When he walked through the clearing, Shadow padded quietly beside him, their breaths forming twin clouds in the frozen air. At first, the dog limped heavily, each step cautious. Ethan would slow his pace, pretending to study tracks in the snow just to let him rest. "See that?" he'd say, pointing at a print. "Coyote, 3, maybe 4 days old." Shadow would sniff, tail giving a faint wag. Ethan grinned. "Guess you're my new assistant, huh?" The humor was subtle, but it was there, a warmth breaking through years of cold. One afternoon, the wind howled fiercely across the ridge, and Ethan decided to take Shadow out farther than before, just a short loop past the frozen stream. The dog trotted beside him, stronger now, fur glossy in the pale light. Halfway down the trail, Shadow suddenly bounded ahead, ears perked, tail flicking high. Ethan called after him, but the dog didn't stop. For the first time since the rescue, there was no limp in his stride. He was running, truly running. Ethan stopped and watched, breath caught in his chest. The image seared into him, a black and tan figure cutting across the snow, sending white powder flying in arcs. Freedom incarnate. He found himself laughing aloud, the sound echoing through the valley. Shadow turned at the sound, barked once, sharp, joyous, then galloped back, circling Ethan like a child demanding praise. "Show off," Ethan said, crouching to ruffle his fur. Shadow licked his gloved hand, tail thumping hard against his leg. For a man who had lived 10 years in silence, that single moment felt like sunlight breaking through ice. Inside that night, as the wind howled outside, Ethan sat at his small desk and opened his worn leather journal. His handwriting was uneven, a mix of observation and something more personal. Day 19, subject, Shadow, demonstrates remarkable recovery rate. Mobility restored, coordination strong, appears attached, watches constantly, follows my movements. I speak to him often. Strange. It feels natural. He stared at the page for a long moment, before adding, almost reluctantly, "The silence doesn't hurt as much anymore." He closed the journal and looked toward the stove. Shadow was curled beside it, fast asleep, paws twitching in some dream. The light from the fire painted his fur in gold and copper. Ethan leaned back, exhaustion giving way to peace. "Good night, Shadow," he whispered. The dog stirred, tail flicking once, as if answering. Days blurred into one another after that. Ethan noticed how the forest's rhythms seemed to change. The birds came closer to the cabin now, unafraid of the human scent mixed with something gentler. When he whistled, Shadow came running. When he called, the dog's ears perked instantly. They became two parts of the same pattern, man and dog moving through the wilderness as if they had always belonged there together. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, Ethan caught himself talking aloud, about the stars, about migration charts, about the silence. Shadow would tilt his head, listening, as if the words mattered. "You know," Ethan said one morning, watching snow fall beyond the window, "I used to think the forest was empty. Turns out, it was just waiting for you." Shadow thumped his tail once, soft, steady, and Ethan smiled. Not the tight, practiced smile of solitude, but the real kind. The kind that belongs to someone who has finally found a reason to hope again. By the end of winter, the cabin was no longer a refuge from the world. Time by 100 milestone, it was home. And for the first time in a decade, Ethan Ward woke not to silence, but to the soft sound of paws against the wooden floor. A quiet rhythm that said, "You're not alone anymore." The first thaw came quietly that year. The snow melted into thin silver veins that trickled down through the valley, and the forest began to breathe again. Pines exhaled the scent of damp bark. The air was thick with the smell of earth and renewal. Ethan could feel it in his bones. The season of stillness had passed. He strapped his field pack across his shoulder and looked down at Shadow, who waited by the door, tail thumping once against the floorboards. The shepherd's wounds had healed, though faint scars still traced his neck and foreleg. They no longer looked like marks of pain, but reminders of endurance, proof of something that had survived. "Well," Ethan said, pulling on his gloves, "ready to get back to work?" Shadow tilted his head, ears perked, as if he understood every word. Ethan smiled. "I'll take that as a yes." They began their morning treks again, moving through the wilderness like two parts of the same rhythm. Shadow trotted slightly ahead, nose close to the ground, reading invisible signs the way only a creature born to the wild could. Ethan followed, notebook in hand, marking migration trails, examining prints pressed into soft earth. It was work he'd done for years, but now the forest felt different. Less a field of study, more a living companion. Sometimes, Shadow would stop abruptly, head lifted, body tense. Ethan had learned to trust those moments. Once Shadow froze just seconds before a small avalanche of snow slid from a branch overhead, narrowly missing them both. Another time he growled low at a cluster of rocks that looked harmless, until Ethan realized a rattlesnake had coiled there, camouflaged perfectly in the dust. "You're better than my instruments," Ethan muttered, scribbling in his notes. "Maybe I should put you on the payroll." Shadow barked once, short and proud, before resuming his patrol. Ethan laughed, a sound so unfamiliar in his own throat, it startled him. Days blurred into weeks, each one marked by new discoveries. They found traces of a bear den, deer prints near the stream, claw marks on a fallen pine. Every evening, Ethan would log his findings by lantern light. Shadow curled nearby, watching with those intelligent eyes that always seemed to see past the surface of things. Ethan often caught himself talking aloud as he worked. "You know," he'd say, "I used to hate silence. It felt like something heavy pressing down on me. Now," he'd pause, glancing at the dog, "now it feels like peace." Shadow would shift slightly, resting his head on his paws, tail flicking once as if agreeing. Ethan realized something subtle but profound had changed in him. For years, he'd studied life from a distance, observing, measuring, never engaging. But with Shadow beside him, life no longer felt like data. It felt present. One late afternoon, they were trekking through a dense grove where the light filtered through in golden slivers. The air smelled of wet moss and pine sap. Ethan was noting tree growth patterns when he heard Shadow's low growl. Soft, but urgent. "What is it?" Ethan whispered. Shadow's body stiffened, gaze fixed on the ridge ahead. A moment later, Ethan heard it too, the low rumble of movement. He turned slowly and saw a flash of dark fur through the underbrush, a black bear, massive and wary, emerging from the shadows, barely 30 yards away. Ethan froze. His pulse thundered in his ears. He'd had encounters before, but never without a firearm close at hand. And this time, all he had was a notepad, and a shepherd standing between him and danger. "Easy," he breathed, hands raised. "Don't move fast." The bear lifted its head, sniffing. It let out a deep grunt and took a slow step forward. Shadow growled, low and steady, placing himself squarely in front of Ethan. The dog's fur bristled, eyes locked on the threat. "Shadow, no," Ethan whispered, afraid to break the fragile tension. But the bear hesitated, sniffed once more, and then as if deciding these two didn't matter, turned away, lumbering back into the trees. Only when the sound of its heavy steps faded did Ethan exhale. His knees felt weak. Shadow turned to look at him, panting lightly, eyes bright and steady. Ethan knelt, pressing a trembling hand to the dog's neck. "You just stared down a bear," he said softly. "You're insane, but thank you." The shepherd's tail wagged once as if to say, "Anytime." That night, the sky turned black with thunder. The storm came sudden and fierce, rain slamming against the cabin roof, lightning splitting the night like white fire. Ethan shut the shutters, checked the lanterns, and settled near the stove. Shadow paced restlessly, ears twitching at every roll of thunder. When a deafening crack shook the cabin, Ethan flinched, heart pounding. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Outside, the storm raged, a primal, living thing. For a moment, old fears returned, the kind that had haunted him since the night ranger died in a flash flood years ago. The helplessness, the loss. The memory rose unbidden, cruelly vivid. His hands trembled. Then he felt something warm press against his leg, level, moderate. Shadow. The dog nudged closer, curling against him, head resting over Ethan's knee. His body was solid, steady, a living heartbeat in the dark. Ethan's hand found the soft fur behind his ears. "You don't like storms either, huh?" he murmured. A flash of lightning lit the room, illuminating the two of them, man and dog, framed against the golden flicker of the dying fire. Shadow lifted his head slightly, eyes calm now, as if saying, "It's all right. I'm here." Ethan drew a deep breath, his fear slowly ebbing away. He leaned back against the wall, letting the sound of the rain fill the silence. The warmth of Shadow's body radiated through him, grounding him more than any human presence ever had. "I used to think I was done with this," Ethan whispered. "Caring, trusting, losing." He swallowed hard. "But you make me forget all that." Shadow let out a low rumble, half sigh, half reassurance, and pressed closer. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel like he was enduring the storm. He was weathering it, side by side, with something that understood. As the thunder softened into distant murmurs, Ethan's eyes grew heavy. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint orange light across the floor. He drifted between waking and sleep, his hand resting on Shadow's back, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of life beneath his palm. Outside, the storm began to pass. The rain eased to a whisper against the glass, and dawn crept quietly into the valley. When Ethan opened his eyes again, the first light touched the room, revealing Shadow still there, watchful, loyal, unshaken. The wilderness no longer felt like an enemy to be studied or survived. It felt like home, and the dog beside him, the one who had once been a stranger, had become the heartbeat of that home. Morning came wrapped in mist, thick enough to blur the world into shades of silver and gray. The forest seemed half asleep, the air damp and cold against Ethan's face as he moved along the narrow trail with Shadow padding quietly ahead. Every exhale rose in faint clouds, every sound felt swallowed by fog. It was supposed to be a simple tracking survey. Check camera traps, collect data, head home before the sun burned through the haze. But halfway down the slope, Shadow stopped. Ethan nearly walked into him. "What is it, boy?" The dog's body stiffened, head high, tail frozen mid-air. Then came the bark, sharp, fractured, nothing like Ethan had ever heard. It wasn't the deep, confident bark of warning he'd learned to recognize. It was higher, raw, half alarm, half plea. "Easy," Ethan murmured, scanning the tree line. "Show me." Shadow bolted forward, disappearing into the mist. "Shadow!" Ethan called, pushing through the underbrush, branches slapping his shoulders. The air smelled of wet earth and pine sap. Somewhere ahead, Shadow barked again, shorter this time, urgent. Ethan followed the sound, slipping on damp roots, his pulse quickening. Then, through the pale veil of fog, he saw her. A small figure lying beside a fallen log, motionless. For a moment, Ethan thought his eyes were deceiving him. Maybe a lost doll, a trick of the light. But as he drew closer, reality struck hard. It was a child. A girl. Maybe 8 years old. Her body curled on its side, her hair tangled with leaves and dirt. Shadow was already there, lying close but not touching her, whining softly. His ears were pinned back, eyes fixed on Ethan as if begging him to help. Ethan dropped to his knees. "Oh God." The girl's skin was pale beneath streaks of mud. Time to 400 mams. Her clothes, a flannel shirt 2 sizes too big, torn jeans, were soaked through, the fabric dark with moisture, and something darker, dried blood. A faint trail ran from her temple down to her cheek. "Hey," Ethan said gently, brushing hair from her face. "Can you hear me?" No response. Her lips were cracked, her breathing shallow but steady. He checked her pulse, weak but there. Relief hit him like air after drowning. He looked over her small frame and saw bruises along her arms, a purplish handprint near her shoulder. His stomach turned. Whatever had happened, it wasn't an accident. Shadow whined again, pressing his nose against her hand. When she didn't move, he let out a sound that was almost mournful. Ethan's hands trembled as he pulled his jacket off and wrapped it around her small body. The warmth of the fabric felt useless against the chill that had settled into her skin. "Hang on, sweetheart," he whispered. "You're safe now." He lifted her carefully, one arm beneath her shoulders, the other supporting her legs. She was light, frighteningly so, limp as a bundle of wet leaves. Shadow rose instantly, circling once before taking point ahead of him, pausing every few steps to make sure Ethan followed. The climb back up the ridge felt endless. Fog clung to the trees like ghosts, and the world was silent except for Ethan's labored breathing and the faint crunch of snow beneath his boots. The girl's head rested against his chest, her breath shallow, a small puff of warmth against his neck that told him she was still alive. He spoke to her softly as he walked, partly to keep himself calm, partly because silence felt unbearable. "My name's Ethan. You're gonna be okay, all right? We'll get you warm. We'll get you food. Just hang on." At one point, the trail narrowed around a steep ravine. The damp ground gave way under his boot, and he slipped, falling to one knee. The girl's head lolled dangerously. Shadow barked, rushing to his side. "I'm fine," Ethan grunted, adjusting his grip. "Almost there." By the time the cabin came into view, the mist had thickened again, turning the clearing into a soft blur of white. Ethan pushed through the door with his shoulder and laid the girl gently on the cot near the stove. He stoked the fire higher until the flames flared bright orange, filling the room with heat and the scent of burning pine. Shadow settled beside the cot immediately, resting his chin on the blanket, eyes never leaving the girl's face. Ethan soaked a cloth in warm water and began to clean the dried blood from her temple. Beneath the grime, he saw freckles scattered across her nose, a detail so human, so ordinary, that it nearly broke him. "Who are you, kid?" he murmured. Then he froze. Recognition flickered like lightning. The face, though thinner, dirt-streaked, belonged to Clara Hargrove, the daughter of Tom Hargrove, the widowed fisherman who lived down the mountain. Ethan had seen them a few times at the trading post, the father quiet, polite, the girl always clutching a sketchbook, smiling shyly when Ethan gave her apples from his supplies. "What in God's name happened to you?" he whispered. Clara stirred faintly, a small sound escaping her lips. Not quite words, just a fragile moan. Ethan leaned closer. "Easy, sweetheart. Don't try to talk." He dabbed antiseptic on the cut, then pulled the blanket up to her chin. Her tiny fingers twitched once before falling still. Behind him, Shadow gave a low, protective growl when the wind rattled the window. Ethan turned. "It's okay, boy. She's safe now." The dog eased back, but didn't move from her side. His gaze was unyielding. Sentinel guarding a fragile life. Ethan sank onto the chair beside the cot, exhaustion and confusion warring inside him. He stared at the two of them, the girl wrapped in his old jacket, the dog lying close enough for her fingers to touch his fur, and felt something stir deep in his chest. For years, the wilderness had been his escape from humanity. But now, here it was again, lying unconscious under his roof, fragile and broken, asking for nothing but mercy. He reached out, brushing a damp strand of hair from Clara's forehead. "You're safe," he whispered again, almost to convince himself. Shadow let out a soft sigh and closed his eyes, his body pressed protectively against the cot. Outside, the mist thickened until the forest disappeared entirely, as if the world itself had drawn its curtain around them, isolating this small cabin where three lives had just collided. Ethan sat there for a long time, listening to the faint crackle of fire and the girl's uneven breathing. Every few minutes, Shadow's tail twitched, his ears flicking toward her, as if counting each fragile breath. Finally, Ethan whispered, "Good boy. You found her." The dog's tail thumped once, soft and steady. In that quiet, something shifted, not in the room, but in the space between them all. It was as if the forest had offered him another test, another life to protect. And deep down, Ethan knew he wouldn't fail this one. The night stretched long and silent over the mountains, the kind of silence that carries the weight of things unspoken. The small cabin was swallowed in darkness, except for a single lantern burning low on the table, its light trembling with every gust of wind that slipped through the cracks in the wooden walls. Outside, snow whispered against the windows. Inside, Ethan fought a different kind of storm. The girl's fever had climbed. Her small body shivered beneath the wool blanket, skin flushed with heat, lips pale. Every few minutes, she stirred, half-conscious, murmuring fragments of words that didn't make sense. Ethan wiped the sweat from her forehead with a damp cloth, his movements careful and deliberate. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, smoke, and the metallic tang of fear. Shadow lay beside the cot, his chin resting near the girl's hand. He hadn't moved since Ethan brought her in. His ears twitched every time she whimpered, his low whine echoing the ache that filled the room. When Ethan reached for the medicine bottle, the dog's eyes followed every motion, as if making sure the man didn't falter. "Easy now," Ethan whispered. "You're gonna pull through. Both of you did." He didn't know who he was trying to convince, the girl or himself. He poured a small dose of fever medicine into a tin cup and coaxed her to sip, supporting her head with a steady hand. She resisted at first, unconscious instinct tightening her lips. But when Shadow gave a quiet, comforting sound, she relaxed, swallowing weakly before sinking back into uneasy sleep. Ethan sat back in the chair beside the cot, rubbing his temples. His own reflection in the lantern glass looked like a stranger, eyes hollowed by worry, jaw tight with helplessness. He hadn't cared for another human being in years. Time passed down. Not since the world took everything that once tethered him to it. He looked at the child again. A small hand lay outside the blanket, bruised and scraped, fingers curled as if grasping for something that wasn't there. The sight tugged something deep inside him, a thread of memory he thought had long since frayed. It was a different cabin then, different forest. He was 10. His mother lay in bed, pale as the snow outside, coughing softly into a rag that never stopped coming away red. His father was gone most days, working distant jobs to pay for medicine that never arrived in time. Ethan had sat on the edge of that same kind of cot, holding her hand as fever took her further away from him. "Promise me you'll be strong," she had whispered, "even when you're alone." He remembered her hand slipping from his grasp, her last breath faint as candle smoke. The silence that followed had stayed with him his whole life, an emptiness that no voice could fill. After she died, he ran. From the house, from the town. From everyone who said, "It's going to be all right." He'd built his adult life out of distance, between him and people, between him and pain. The wilderness was supposed to be the cure, but isolation, he realized now, hadn't healed him. It had only preserved the wound. A soft whimper pulled him back to the present. Clara stirred, tossing slightly in her sleep. Her forehead glistened with sweat again. Ethan reached out to adjust the blanket, his hand hesitating in midair. "I'm not made for this," he thought. "I study life. I don't fix it." But the memory of the wire trap came back. The way Shadow had looked at him that day, pleading without words. He hadn't known what he was doing then either. And still, he'd saved a life. He took a deep breath and pressed the cool cloth to her forehead again. "Come on, kid," he murmured. "You made it this far. Don't stop now." Shadow's tail thumped once against the floor, as if echoing his plea. Hours passed. The lantern flame burned lower, flickering across the wooden walls in waves of gold and shadow. Ethan lost track of time, dozing off for brief moments before jerking awake at every sigh or movement. The storm outside had calmed, but the storm inside him grew stronger, a tangle of fear, guilt, and something unfamiliar. Hope. At one point, Clara began to mumble again, words slurred by fever. Ethan leaned closer. "Daddy, don't let them. Please." The sound of that word, "Daddy," hit him like a blade twisting deep. He swallowed hard, whispering back, "You're safe now. Nobody's gonna hurt you again." Her breathing steadied, though the fever still burned. Ethan stayed by her side, fingers pressed lightly to her wrist, feeling the faint pulse beneath the fragile skin. Across from him, Shadow lifted his head, meeting Ethan's eyes. The two locked gazes for a long moment. No words, no sound, just understanding. In that look, Ethan saw it clearly for the first time. The connection between them all. The dog he'd saved. The child the dog had led him to. Three broken souls, thrown together by something that felt too deliberate to be chance. Maybe the wilderness wasn't trying to isolate him after all. Maybe it was trying to return something he'd lost. Dawn came slowly. Gray light spilling through the frost-lined windows. The lantern had burned itself out, leaving the room bathed in soft blue. Ethan blinked away the fatigue, his neck stiff from hours of stillness. He checked Clara's forehead again, and felt the fever breaking. Her skin was cooler now, her breathing deep and even. Relief came so sudden it left him dizzy. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, the exhaustion finally catching up. The world narrowed to the rhythm of two heartbeats, one steady and strong beside him, one small and fragile in front of him. Then, faintly, the girl stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first. Ethan leaned forward. "Hey there. Easy. You're safe." She blinked, lips parting, and then her gaze shifted slightly, to the shadow at her side. "Shadow," she whispered. The word was barely audible, but it struck through the quiet like a bell. Ethan froze, watching as Shadow lifted his head, tail moving once. The girl's hand reached out weakly, brushing his fur. Then, with a small sigh, she drifted back into sleep. Ethan sat motionless, the echo of her voice hanging in the air. Shadow. The name she'd spoken without being told. He felt something break open inside him, something he hadn't realized was still locked away. The dog he'd rescued, the child who now rested under his roof. Both had found him, as if drawn to the same faint flicker of kindness he thought had died years ago. He wasn't just a scientist anymore, not just a man observing life from a safe distance. He was part of it again. He reached out, resting a hand on Shadow's head. The dog leaned into his touch, eyes half closed. Ethan whispered, "We did good, didn't we?" Outside, the first light of morning crept over the mountains, touching the snow in gold. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire caught the edge of that light, wrapping man, dog, and child in a single fragile circle of peace. And for the first time in 10 years, Ethan Ward didn't feel alone. 3 days passed before Clara's fever finally broke for good. The cabin, once filled with the sound of her labored breathing, now hummed with quiet life. Sunlight filtered through the window panes, soft and golden. Dust motes dancing in the air like tiny spirits. Ethan sat at the table, sorting field notes that no longer held his attention. Across the room, Clara dozed under the blanket, Shadow lying at her feet like a sentinel carved from fur and muscle. Whenever the girl stirred, the dog lifted his head, eyes flicking toward Ethan for reassurance. She was stronger now. Pale, yes, but awake, aware. Each day she spoke a little more. Her voice, hoarse from disuse, came in fragments, half memories and half fear. The first morning she spoke, it was just one sentence. "They took Daddy." Ethan looked up sharply. "Who did, Clara?" She shook her head, eyes distant. "I don't know. Men. They came to the cabin. They were shouting and drinking." Her small hands trembled when she spoke, fingers clutching the blanket as if it could protect her from the memory. Shadow pressed closer, resting his head on her knee. The gesture steadied her, more than words could. "They hurt him?" Ethan asked gently. Clara didn't answer. She only whispered, "Then I ran." That night, her nightmares returned. Fragments of screams, breaking glass, the echo of a door slamming. Ethan sat beside her through most of it, wiping her forehead, whispering quiet things meant more to calm himself than her. But when dawn came, something in him hardened. If her story was true, if men had attacked that cabin, then the woods weren't as empty as he thought. And the taunt pattern clicked in his mind like pieces of a dark puzzle. The traps, the wounded dog, the poachers. It was all connected. By mid-morning, he had packed his field gear and loaded his rifle. Shadow watched silently from the doorway, head tilted as if sensing what his human was about to do. Ethan crouched, checking the straps on his pack. "We're just going to look," he said softly. "No heroics. Just find out what happened." Shadow thumped his tail once, not quite approval, but understanding. He left Clara asleep. The fire banked low. He scribbled a note on the table in his neat block handwriting. "Stay inside. Shadow and I will be back before sundown." The air outside bit at his skin, sharp, crisp, alive. The forest was quiet again, but not peaceful. The kind of quiet that felt like a held breath before a storm. Ethan and Shadow moved down the narrow trail toward the valley, boots sinking into half-frozen ground. The path wound through stands of pine that whispered softly in the breeze. Every so often, Shadow would stop, nose to the wind, body taut. The dog's instincts were sharper than any compass, and right now, they were leading the way. When they reached the river, the smell hit first, faint, metallic, unmistakable. Blood. Ethan froze, scanning the banks. The snow was patchy here, streaked with mud where the river's edge had thawed. He saw prints, boot tracks, wide and heavy, and beside them, drag marks. Something, or someone, had been pulled toward the water. Shadow whined low in his throat, pacing near the tracks. His nose pressed to the ground, tracing the scent. Ethan crouched beside him. "You smell it too, don't you?" The dog's tail dropped, ears flattened. Then Ethan saw it, a dark stain half buried beneath slush and pine needles. He brushed it with his gloved hand, the crimson blooming fresh against the snow. Not animal blood. Human. His heart sank. A few feet farther down the bank, something else caught his eye. A broken bottle, its edge stained. And near it, the torn sleeve of a flannel shirt. Ethan picked it up. He recognized the pattern instantly. The same kind of shirt Tom Hargrove always wore. "God," he whispered. He turned toward the trees, jaw clenched. Every instinct screamed that they were not alone in this part of the valley. Shadow's ears perked, head snapping toward the opposite bank. A moment later, Ethan heard it too. Faint voices carried on the wind. Male, rough, laughing. He ducked behind a fallen tree, signaling for Shadow to stay low. Peering through the branches, he saw them. Two men in torn jackets, rifles slung over their shoulders, standing beside a rusted pickup near the river's edge. One of them kicked at something in the back of the truck, muttering. Ethan couldn't see what it was. A tarp, maybe. But he recognized their faces. A week earlier, he'd seen those same men at the supply post on the far side of the mountain. They were known troublemakers, hunters without licenses, men who bragged about cleaning up predators, poachers. The realization hit hard and cold. These were the same kind of men who had set the wire traps, the same kind who had nearly killed Shadow. And now, they'd come for the fishermen who lived too close to their territory. Ethan's grip tightened on his rifle, but he didn't move. He couldn't risk a confrontation, not without backup. One of the men spat into the river. "Told you, the old man won't talk now." The other laughed. "Yeah, and nobody's gonna find him down there." Ethan's stomach turned. Down there. The river ran fast and dark this time of year. Snowmelt swelling the current. It could carry anything away, body or secret. He waited until the men climbed back into the truck, their laughter fading as the engine roared to life. Only when the sound disappeared into the forest did Ethan move again. He crossed the clearing slowly, heart pounding. The spot they had stood on was soaked through with mud. He saw fresh tire tracks, boot prints, and near the water's edge the faint outline of something heavy dragged into the current. He didn't need to see more. He knew. Tom Hargrove was gone. Shadow stood beside him, fur bristling, eyes locked on the place where the river churned and foamed. Ethan rested a trembling hand on the dog's neck. "They killed him," he said quietly, and she saw enough to make her run. For a long time he just stood there, staring into the current, the rush of water loud enough to drown his thoughts. When he finally turned back toward the forest, the decision was already made. He couldn't undo what had happened, but he could stop it from happening again. "Come on, boy," he said, voice low but steady. "We're not done yet." Shadow barked once, sharp and resolute, before leading the way up the ridge. Behind them, the river kept flowing, a restless ribbon of secrets winding through the wilderness, carrying away the proof of human cruelty, but not their resolve. For the first time in years, Ethan Ward felt the pull of purpose stronger than fear. The hunter's instincts were awake, and this time, he wasn't hunting animals. He was hunting men. Night came heavy and windless, pressing down on the forest like a held breath. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and cold smoke, and above the valley, the moon drifted behind clouds thick as bruises. Inside the cabin, the lantern burned low, throwing slow, wavering shadows against the walls. Ethan sat at his desk, writing notes he didn't really see. Each line bled into the next, his thoughts consumed by what he had discovered down by the river, by the voices, the laughter, the finality in those men's words. He'd buried that horror deep for Clara's sake, but it gnawed at him all the same. Behind him, the faint sound of soft breathing reminded him what was at stake. Clara was asleep on the cot, one small hand curled beneath her cheek. Shadow lay at her side, head resting near her shoulder, his steady breaths rising and falling with hers. The sight softened Ethan's chest every time he looked. He reached to turn down the lantern wick. The flame dimmed. The forest outside was still. Too still. Then, Shadow lifted his head. The motion was silent but sharp, every muscle going rigid, ears pricking forward. A low growl rumbled in his throat, the kind that came from deep in the chest, primal and certain. Ethan froze. "What is it, boy?" Shadow rose to his feet, moving toward the door, hackles raised. His growl deepened. That was when Ethan heard it. A faint crunch of snow outside, deliberate and slow. Then another. He stood, every nerve alive. The rifle leaned against the wall, half a step away. He reached for it, heart pounding, and snuffed the lantern with a swift twist of his fingers. The cabin sank into darkness. "Clara," he whispered, crossing to the cot. "Wake up, honey." Her eyes fluttered open, confused and heavy with sleep. "Ethan?" "Quiet," he said, crouching beside her. "Don't make a sound." Outside, the crunching grew louder. More than one pair of boots now. The creak of wood under weight. Then a muffled voice. "Check around back. He's got to be here somewhere." Ethan's stomach turned to ice. They'd followed him. He motioned for Clara to stay low, then moved toward the door, rifle ready. Shadow stayed beside the girl, eyes locked on the window, teeth bared in a silent snarl. The doorknob rattled once. Then, with a splintering crack, the door swung inward. The first man through barely had time to shout before Ethan fired. The rifle roared in the small space, the shot tearing into the doorframe beside the intruder's head. The man ducked, cursing, firing back blindly. Glass shattered. A lantern exploded into flame near the wall, and suddenly the cabin was alive with chaos. Light and smoke and the deafening echo of gunfire. "Stay down!" Ethan shouted, throwing himself over Clara. Shadow lunged, a streak of fury and movement. The shepherd hit the nearest man like a storm, teeth clamping down on the arm that held the gun. The poacher screamed, stumbling back, trying to shake the dog loose. But Shadow's jaws held fast, his growl rising over everything else. The second intruder kicked the door wider, leveling his weapon. Ethan saw the glint of the barrel and fired again, the recoil slamming through his shoulder. The man went down with a cry, the sound swallowed by the roaring flames from the shattered lantern. Smoke filled the room, choking and acrid. The heat grew fast, orange light flickering along the walls. Time 500 psalms. "Shadow!" Ethan called, coughing, eyes watering. The dog still fought the first man, refusing to release his grip, even as the intruder swung wildly with his free arm. Blood spattered across the floor. "Get him off me!" the man roared, staggering backward toward the open door. His hand found a pistol at his belt. Ethan saw it too late. The gun fired once, a sharp, brutal sound that cut through everything. Shadow yelped, his body twisting mid-lunge. For an instant, time stopped. The sound of the shot hung in the air, like something unholy. Then, the shepherd collapsed. His body hit the floor hard, breath gone in a single broken gasp. "No!" Ethan's scream tore from his chest, raw and hollow. He raised the rifle, firing again and again, until the gun clicked empty. The remaining intruders stumbled backward into the snow, vanishing into the night. Smoke filled the room, flames licking up the wall where the lantern oil had spread. Clara was crying, clutching the blanket to her chest. Ethan dropped the rifle and crawled to where Shadow lay. The dog's side heaved shallowly, blood seeping between his fur. Ethan pressed his hands over the wound, desperate, trembling. "No, no, no. Stay with me," he whispered. "You hear me? You stay with me." Shadow's eyes fluttered open. For a heartbeat, they were clear, warm and full of the same fierce light Ethan had seen that day in the trap. His tail thumped weakly once, a ghost of motion. Then his gaze shifted, toward the girl. Clara was kneeling beside them now, tears streaking her face. She reached out, her small hand trembling as she touched the dog's head. "Shadow, please don't go." The shepherd's breathing slowed. Ethan could feel it, the life slipping like water through his fingers. The fire crackled louder, devouring the wall behind them. Smoke rolled across the ceiling. Ethan's lungs burned, but he couldn't move. He couldn't let go. "Ethan!" Clara coughed. "We have to go." He looked down at the dog one last time. Shadow's eyes had closed, his body still. The world narrowed to a soundless point. Just Ethan's heartbeat, and the weight of everything he'd already lost once before. He bent low, pressing his forehead to the dog's. His voice broke. "You saved her. You saved us both." Then, with shaking arms, he scooped Clara up and ran through the smoke toward the broken door. The cold night hit them like a slap, wind tearing at the flames behind. The cabin crackled and roared, fire spilling from the windows like molten gold. They stumbled into the snow, coughing, eyes burning. Ethan turned back once. The home that had sheltered them now an inferno. the light of it painting the trees in red and orange. His scream tore through the mountain air, not of fear, but of loss so deep it felt like the earth itself might split open. "Shadow!" The cry echoed across the valley, carried by the wind, rising and fading into the endless dark. Beside him, Clara buried her face into his coat, sobbing. Ethan wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. His body shook, from cold, from shock, from grief he couldn't contain. And somewhere beyond the fire, in the shadowed forest that had always watched them, the wild went silent again, as if even nature itself was mourning the guardian it had claimed. Snow fell softly over the smoking ruins of the cabin, covering the blackened wood and scattered embers like a burial shroud. The fire had died to smoldering patches of red, the night air thick with the acrid scent of burnt pine and gunpowder. Ethan knelt in the snow, his arms wrapped around Shadow's limp body, his breath ragged in the freezing air. The shepherd's fur was matted with blood, dark against the pale ground. Every few seconds, Ethan pressed his hand to the dog's side, searching for movement, any sign that life still lingered. He found it once, faint and uneven, then almost lost it again. "Stay with me," he whispered, voice hoarse from smoke and shouting. "You hear me, boy? You don't get to quit on me now." Clara knelt beside him, small and shaking, tears streaking through the soot on her cheeks. Her hands were pressed together, trembling near her chest. She whispered something Ethan couldn't hear at first, a soft murmur, repeated over and over. Then her voice broke through the wind, fragile, but fierce. "Please, God, don't take him. Please don't take the brave dog." The words hit Ethan harder than the cold ever could. He blinked hard against the sting in his eyes, pressing the torn edges of Shadow's wound together with strips of fabric from his own shirt. His hands were slick with blood. The metallic smell clung to everything. "You're not losing him," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Not after all this." He dragged Shadow into what remained of the cabin, the back corner still intact, walls scorched but standing. He laid the dog on a blanket near the stove, where a weak fire flickered after he'd rekindled it from what coals remained. The dim orange light painted everything in shades of desperation. Ethan's movements became mechanical. Clean, stitch, bandage. Breathe. His fingers trembled with fatigue, the edges of his vision blurring. The bullet wound had grazed Shadow's ribs but missed the heart. Luck, or grace, or something greater had intervened. Still, the bleeding was bad. Too much blood on the floor. Too much time lost. Clara knelt on the opposite side, handing him strips of cloth, doing everything he asked without question. Her face was pale but determined, her small fingers stained crimson. "You're doing good," Ethan said quietly, not looking up. "Keep pressure there. That's it." Her voice quivered. Is he going to die?" Ethan didn't answer right away. His throat closed around the truth he refused to speak. "Not if I can help it." Hours crawled by, each one longer than the last. Outside, the storm had settled into a ghostly calm, wind whispering softly through the burnt pines. Inside, time had narrowed to the rhythm of Shadow's breath. Shallow, faltering, but still there. Ethan changed the bandages again, working with the focus of a surgeon and the desperation of a man who had already lost too much. Once the dog's eyes fluttered open, glazed, unfocused, and Ethan froze. "Hey," he whispered, leaning close. "It's me. You're safe." Shadow blinked slowly, his tail twitching once against the blanket. Then his gaze drifted toward Clara. She leaned forward, tears clinging to her lashes. "He knows you," Ethan said softly. "He knows we're here." She reached out, placing a tiny hand over Shadow's paw. "You can rest, okay? But don't go." Ethan swallowed hard, forcing himself to keep working. His shoulders ached, his hands raw, but he didn't stop, couldn't stop. He cleaned the wound again, added stitches where the bleeding threatened to start anew, and whispered steady, meaningless words as he worked. "Good, boy. You're strong. Stay with us." The lantern's flame flickered lower as night dragged on. Clara had fallen half asleep beside Shadow, her hand still resting on his paw. Ethan sat slumped against the wall, eyes burning with exhaustion. Every few minutes he reached out to feel the dog's heartbeat, terrified it might stop between one breath and the next. Then, somewhere between the fading stars and the first light of dawn, Shadow stirred. It was subtle at first. A faint twitch of his ear, a tremor in his flank. Then, a low, rumbling sound, weak but unmistakable. A growl-turned sigh. Ethan's head snapped up. "Shadow?" The dog's eyes opened, slow and heavy, and found him. There was recognition there, faint, weary, but real. Clara woke too, blinking at the sound. When she saw him move, she gasped, covering her mouth. "He's alive!" Ethan exhaled shakily, laughter breaking through his tears. "Yeah," he whispered, brushing a hand over the shepherd's head. "He's alive." Shadow's breathing steadied little by little. The worst had passed. The bullet had missed the vital organs, and the bleeding had slowed. It would be a long recovery, but there was a future now. A chance. Ethan leaned back against the wall, the weight of the night crashing down all at once. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to cry. Not from loss this time, but from something closer to gratitude. When the Rangers arrived later that morning, drawn by the distant echo of gunfire, they found the cabin scarred but standing, smoke curling from the broken roof. Ethan met them at the edge of the clearing, rifle slung across his back, eyes hollow with exhaustion. Behind him, Clara stood in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket. Shadow lay just inside, bandaged and resting, his head lifting slightly when the men approached. The Rangers listened in grim silence as Ethan told them what had happened. The poachers, the attack, the fire. His voice was low, steady, the words worn thin from the telling. When he finished, the lead ranger placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll take it from here," the man said. "You did good, Ward. Real good." By afternoon, the men had tracked the surviving poachers along the river trail. 2 arrests, 1 wounded. Justice, or at least something that looked like it. Ethan stood in the clearing long after the Rangers left, watching their tire tracks fade into the snow. The valley was silent again, but it no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like survival. He turned back toward the cabin, what was left of it, and saw Clara sitting beside Shadow, her hand stroking his fur. The dog's eyes followed her every movement, his tail brushing weakly against the floor. Ethan walked inside and crouched beside them. "He's going to make it," he said quietly. Clara looked up, smiling through tears. "You saved him." Ethan shook his head. "No," he said softly. "He saved us." The fire crackled softly, warm against the cold that still clung to the world outside. For the first time, the cabin didn't feel like a fortress built against loneliness. It felt like something else entirely, a refuge rebuilt from the ashes, a symbol of what could still be mended. Outside, dawn spread across the mountains, painting the snow in gold. Inside, a man, a child, and a wounded shepherd sat together in the light of a new beginning, each one breathing proof that even in the wild, life finds its way back to hope. The fire scars faded faster than Ethan expected. Nature, he thought, had a way of forgiving what humans could not. Weeks passed, and the forest began to heal. Green shoots broke through blackened soil. The air smelled of pine and rain instead of smoke. The cabin stood again, patched and sturdy. Its scars spoke of survival, not ruin. Each night the hearth glowed warm, and outside, under the soft spring light, Shadow ran once more. His stride was slower, his coat marked by old burns, but his golden eyes shone with life. Clara's laughter followed. "Wait for me, Shadow," she called, stumbling through the meadow, hair loose and bright. The dog turned, teasing her to chase him again. Their laughter filled the clearing, an echo of innocence reclaimed. From the porch, Ethan watched them, a quiet smile tugging at his face. It had been so long since laughter lived here. Beyond them, the forest stood reborn, charred trunks surrounded by new green. Loss and renewal, he thought, written side by side. "The wilderness doesn't take," he murmured. "It teaches." By afternoon, he joined them by the stream that wound through the valley. Shadow drank, while Clara skipped stones across the current. "Look, that one went all the way," she shouted. Ethan chuckled. "You've got good aim, kiddo." Sunlight caught her hair, and for a moment, she was no longer the frightened child from that night, but a girl reborn, curious, alive. Shadow barked once, trotting close. Clara wrapped her arms around him. "You saved us," she whispered. The words carried like prayer. Ethan turned away, blinking hard. In the heart of the fire they had found one another, man, dog, and child, and somehow, a second chance. That evening, they climbed the ridge behind the cabin, their quiet ritual. Shadow led the way, pausing to be sure they followed. At the top, the valley spread wide below, green and gold under the fading sun, the river shining like silver thread. Clara sat cross-legged beside the dog, his tail thumping softly. "How far can you see from here?" she asked. "Far enough to remember," Ethan said, "and far enough to be grateful." He knelt, tracing a hand over Shadow's scarred fur. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" he murmured, and still came back wagging that tail. Clara smiled. "Because he's brave." "Brave doesn't even begin to cover it," Ethan replied. They sat as the sun sank behind the peaks, wrapped in amber light. A breeze stirred the pines, carrying wildflower scent and wood smoke. An owl called somewhere distant, the sound no longer lonely. Clara leaned against Ethan's arm. Shadow pressed close between them. Together, they formed a small, imperfect constellation beneath the vast sky. Ethan looked out across the valley. The land that had once broken him had given something back. "Sometimes," he said softly, "the wild doesn't take. It gives back what we thought we'd lost forever." Clara smiled. "Like Shadow?" "Exactly like Shadow." The shepherd lifted his head and barked once as the wind wrapped the three of them in gold. Below, the forest whispered, alive again, reborn. Sometimes, stories like this remind us that love doesn't always come from people. Sometimes, it comes on four legs, with a steady heartbeat, and eyes that understand us better than words ever could. German shepherds, especially, have that rare kind of loyalty, the kind that doesn't ask for anything in return, except your presence. They protect, they heal, and somehow they remind us of the best parts of being human. If you've ever felt that quiet bond with your own dog, that gentle look that says, "I'm here," you already know what this story is really about. And if you'd like to deepen that connection, there's a wonderful little resource I've been using that helps strengthen trust and communication between you and your dog. I'll leave the link below. Take a look if it feels right for you. After all, the best stories don't just happen in books or videos. Sometimes, they begin right at your feet, with the friend who never leaves your side.